You're listening to Contesting Wrestling Minisode 21. This is on the Minisodes. In case you are a new listener, Minisodes, we kind of go over corrections and omissions from this week's main feed episode, and we
bring you up to date because the main episodes are recorded several weeks in advance.
Yeah,
usually, so.
And these we usually record like a day or two in advance. So we also kind of shoot the shit about modern stuff, whatever is happening in wrestling right now, and wherever our muses take us.
We kind of let ourselves go off the rails a little bit if we choose to. You gotta let it out somewhere.
So the first thing I want to talk about, and this is related to something I've been plugging for a few weeks now, but during the main feed episode, by the way, which we had Matt Josephson on as our guest, and we were talking about Randy Savage versus Ricky Steamboat, and the much less memorable Vladimir Kozlov versus Shawn Michaels match. Strikingly mediocre.
Strikingly. It was possibly the best Kozlov match.
So Evan had asked me whether there is a philosophy and wrestling person established, and at the time I was not aware of this person. I was somewhat aware of him. I had actually mentioned that he and I are presenting back to back at the upcoming WrestlePosium online on April 4th. Go to prowrestlingstudies.org to register, and you can see both of these presentations.
So you're gonna get him, right?
I'm gonna get him.
Yeah.
So
is this the guy who there's a picture of him on your wall with a bunch of axes that you've thrown at it? That's
then who's that guy then?
There's a guy at Utica College.
No, the poster. Who's the guy in the poster? If it's not this guy,
I don't know. Damn, I can't come up with anything good.
Yeah. That's okay.
That's your mom, Doc.
Oh.
So this guy teaches at Suck College.
He's a professor of analytic philosophy, metaphysics, philosophy of language, that kind of stuff, who happens to be a big wrestling fan, and this year is publishing his book, Philosophy Smackdown. About the relation between philosophy and wrestling. Not exactly the sort of thing that I would write about when I eventually write a book about wrestling.
Yeah,
but
more of a raw
close
guy.
enough. Yeah, more of a raw guy. But it's I think it's actually kind of cool that this is getting out there, and it will be much easier to maybe convince the philosophy powers that be that writing about wrestling in a philosophical context would be a worthwhile thing to do. It was a little bit even more annoying, though, that the title of his talk is very similar to mine. He used the same alliteration between, he's talking about Plato with pile drivers, and my talk is on the poetry in pile drivers. So
do you think do you think he's aware of your work?
Well, I mean, I'm pretty sure he saw the schedule the same way that I did. So, we'll see what happens. He's going on right before me, so which I prefer rather than me having to go first, so I can, if anything, respond to anything that he says if we cover any of the same ground. But no, I think I'm actually really excited that there's another philosopher thinking about wrestling and fairly close by as well.
Well, you can all start a league.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say, I something that really shocked me when we started this and I started getting into it is the discrepancy between how stupid wrestling seems a lot of the times, and especially my memory of wrestling in the Attitude Era, when it was so popular and prevalent in the culture that if you were my age at the time, you learned a lot about wrestling whether you wanted to or not, and how it is this really interesting. So this weekend, I saw some old friends. We got together to play a board game, Gloomhaven, which is really cool but very complex to set up. And they were asking me, how's the podcast going? And I was like, oh, it's good. I'm learning all this stuff. It's surprisingly interesting. I forget how it came up, but somebody asked, how do they get all the fake blood on there? And I was like, actually, when you see wrestling, when you see blood in wrestling, it's pretty much never fake. It's always pretty much always real blood. And she was like, but why would it be real if it's fake? And I was like, well, that's actually what's really interesting about the whole thing, is that it exists in this sort of like nether space between reality and fantasy where everybody kind of goes in knowing that. And, you know, what is, you know, the stuff that makes wrestling interesting is the tension between the reality and the staged part of it.
Yeah.
And, you know, she was like, oh, wow, I had never thought of that before. And like that, I'm consistently surprised. I guess not surprised because I understand the perspective that I had before we started this podcast, but I'm consistently like, feel like people who are interested in weird art forms and the, you know, the relationship between like avant-garde theater and the world and stuff like that. You know, I consistently feel like they should be more interested in wrestling.
Like, you, as somebody who has never been a really like a wrestling fan, but have always known lots of people who are way into wrestling, like picture somebody who isn't a wrestling fan, but then also just isn't exposed to it at all. And a lot of those people think, oh, it's just roided up guys pretending to fight.
Yeah.
A lot of them really think nobody gets hurt even. And it's like, well, I mean, I'm not mad at that thing because it just stems from ignorance, you know, but I mean, that's the attitude a lot of people have, and they don't know what they're talking about.
And most of them haven't really taken any time to watch it.
Right. They were told that it was dumb, and that's all that it takes.
And they'll see like 2 minutes of it or something, or like 30 seconds, and like have a hard time keeping their attention on the thing that's on the screen, and immediately certain things will probably turn them off about it. Well, but yeah, it's really strange. Like I've mentioned this before, that it seems like people who don't have any exposure to wrestling, when they do look at it, and for some reason it always turns out to be the worst possible thing that could be happening on the screen when someone looks at it, which is, I guess, a lot of the time
that's what gets
what's
a gift.
happening. They can't look at it. They like can't really see it.
Well, I do think, I mean, the two big problems with getting into wrestling is, one, I do still think, and I've been, you know, this was my position as of like episode 2, and it's kind of still my position, that the ratio of how much of it is good to how much of it is bad is still all fucked up.
Yeah, we don't watch quite as much like awful stuff as we used to for a few reasons, but you're right. Like a lot of it just either filler or bad.
And then the other problem, and this is, I don't know how wrestling itself could really go about fixing this. The problem is that there's no way to just watch wrestling and understand what makes it interesting. You have to have somebody explain because there's no way, like I said, for me, what makes it interesting is the interplay between reality and fantasy. What makes it interesting is that it lives in this sort of strange postmodern gray area, and I only know that because you guys explain that to me. You're never going to get that watching WWE.
I mean, you're not going to know exactly what the relation is, but I imagine anyone who's curious and watches it will be like, well, I wonder what is real and what is fake here, because it's like, I think those two different things present themselves fairly clearly, no?
I don't know, man, because I think that people, like my friend that I was talking to this weekend, who was just like, well, why wouldn't you just have fake blood? Because the whole thing is a show. I think that people look at it and they're either like, oh, this entire thing is theater, and therefore, like, I don't, you know, why have even the gesture towards athleticism or the contest or something, or there are people who are into sports who are like, well, this isn't sports.
But if you see someone like landing on their head or like falling from a far distance, you know, from a high elevation onto their backs, like, I mean, at least part, like, you know, there's not nets, there aren't wires, and like,
yes,
you know what I mean?
Sure.
Like, some of it has to like clearly.
Well, part of the
present
reason
itself as
why
reality.
they have to be as realistic as possible is that they do it in front of a live audience, and the audience is part of the show. Like, I liken it to, you know, the Roman Colosseum gladiators fighting each other. It's like they're doing it for the entertainment of the audience, but, you know, they're fighting, and that's
Well, they were really fighting a lot.
Yeah. This is a little bit more towards not as real as. I mean, they're not going to murder each other in the ring, obviously.
And I think also that, the fact that a lot of the times the stuff that wrestling is expressing, or like the aesthetic maybe, or the humor or whatever, the fact that seems kind of dumb a lot, I think will make people not care about asking those questions.
Now, sometimes I meet people who are wrestling fans that like are really not at all into like wrestling fandom. They just watch it as a TV show, which is, by the way, as it's intended to be watched, even though a shrinking amount of the people who watch wrestling actually have that position.
Well, I mean, it's a fucking shitty TV. If we're talking about Raw,
Raw is a bad
terrible TV show
these
days.
And ratings continue to drop. But if you just watch a few episodes and you're like, well, I like these characters and don't like these characters, and I'm going to root for these, like you would a soap opera, because it's a soap opera, then I see the appeal in that way. Now, the other way to get into it without being like introduced is just to get into it when you're a little kid, because then you don't care.
Sure.
You watch it, you think it's fun, and you will at least then have a reference point for the rest of your life. Because I find also in my travels, if I talk to a lot of people that don't watch wrestling, they did at some point for some period of time. Yeah. Oftentimes it's a time wrestling boomed, either like, oh, I watched Hogan in the 80s, or I watched Austin in the 90s, or I liked Bill Goldberg for a minute. But a lot of the times it's not. Like if you were a kid in 2006, you'd watch a few years worth of, mid-2000 SmackDown. You'd know Edge and Eddie Guerrero and Batista, But a lot of people watch it for a couple of years, get tired of the shtick, and then shut it off. But at least then they know the deal. They have why people like it in their heads. And they won't ridicule you just for mentioning wrestling like a few people still do. I find it very heartening that wrestling fandom has kind of joined a lot more now than it used to with fandom at large. Because for a long time it wasn't. For a long time you'd go to like nerd spaces or conventions or whatever, and you'd still have to find the wrestling fans and like congregate in a corner and kind of whisper about it, at this place where everybody's into what at the time was already kind of fringe. I mean, of course, geek stuff now is completely mainstream. But that's not the case anymore. People like, Xavier Woods and his video game channel, Up, Down, Down, then he'll just go to nerd conventions and he'll be, the wrestler there. And I just think it's good. Now, if you want to talk about the bridging between reality and fantasy and where you can't really see the line, Randy Savage, the guy that we talked about in like the episode with Matt Josephson. Randy Savage is the perfect example of this, because you don't know what the difference between Randy Poffo and the Macho Man are. There doesn't seem to be a difference. He never outwardly showed any difference. One thing that's great to watch, and you can find it on YouTube, is Randy Savage being interviewed on the Arsenio Hall show, because he doesn't break character at all, but his character is believable as an over-the-top human being when he's not tasked with beating the crap out of somebody. So where's the lie? I mean, if you really want to be entertained on that same series of interviews on Arsenio, watch the one where he hosts The Ultimate Warrior, who also does not break character and just shows up screaming about everything. Good stuff.
So on that note, we had asked Matt about whether in modern wrestling he thought there were any characters that live up to the kind of great larger-than-life characters of 80s and 90s wrestling. And one person we didn't mention, who I think is probably the closest thing we have now, is the Velveteen Dream.
Oh, yeah. Velveteen Dream.
He has a level of flamboyance and just magic to his character that we haven't seen in anyone else. And I look forward to you seeing some Velveteen Dream, Evan.
I haven't seen him at all.
The main reason I wouldn't suggest us to do a full episode on Dream is that he's still just so young. There isn't that much material yet. He's currently in NXT. He's around the top of the NXT mix. Like, he just came back from injury. And like, ever since he emerged as the Velveteen Dream, it's been like, oh, this guy could do it.
I think he'll get the title match at the WrestleMania weekend takeover. It's looking like that.
He would be the most likely guy to take it from Adam Cole, but who knows, man? I can't predict their booking.
Based on my limited knowledge that I have acquired thus far in the podcast, for me, I would say the modern wrestler that most most resembles that sort of 80s style, like channeling of weird elemental forces without really a specific character is Asuka.
Yeah.
Totally.
Because I can't really say what Asuka's character is.
Yeah.
But I fucking love it, and it's internally consistent, even if it's undefinable.
Yeah, it's totally true.
Right. She seems like a person.
Yeah.
You know, a multifaceted person. Not that you know all the facets of it.
Yeah.
It's just you see her in the ring and you think, oh, if I saw her outside on the street, I bet you she's a person.
Yeah.
You know, you can't say that about like the Undertaker. As much as you might love the Undertaker, and like maybe you'd see like the biker kind of Undertaker, but it's not going to be a guy in a long black trench coat speaking about how he's going to demon something.
She's in that middle space though, because she's not like just a person.
Yeah.
Right, like Ricochet.
Right.
Come on, like
Right, Ricochet is just a guy.
He's just a, but she's, you know, a kind of person that if you saw on the street, you would, you know, be in awe of them.
Yeah, she has a presence and a power about her. Her YouTube channel is great. Check
Yeah,
it
I
out.
gotta watch some more of it.
Just take a look at it. You'll think it's cute. I don't like watch every episode on it, but it's clearly a good like YouTube channel.
Another thing about the Velveteen Dream is you had asked during this episode, Evan, about graceful wrestlers. And I think he is one of the more graceful wrestlers.
Yeah.
I would also like to add to that list Jack Evans, especially when we first started watching him in Ring of Honor.
Evans, yes.
He would collapse into a heap after getting power bombed in an incredibly graceful fashion. Kota Ibushi and two other Japanese wrestlers. I think possibly the most graceful wrestler I've ever seen is BB Hulk, who was a star in the Dragon Gate promotion. I think still is, maybe.
I think so. I've dropped off of Dragon Gate a while back.
He was basically like a J-pop dancer. Is
Okay.
really the only way I can describe it?
Yeah, definitely. Like
He had a
teen
whole
idol
troupe
dancer,
of dancers with him, and he would do a whole dance routine before his matches.
The ladies loved it, I tell you.
Yeah, and then also in a slightly different way, Naomichi Marufuji.
Marufuji,
Who's
yes.
possibly my favorite Japanese wrestler of all time.
Very precision.
But just has an incredible mystique to him. We should definitely watch some of his matches eventually as well. One correction. WrestleMania 2, I had the Macho Man Randy Savage versus George the Animal Steele match. I had mistakenly remembered it as ending in a DQ. No, Savage did pin George Steele with I think the tights and his feet on the ropes in a heelish manner.
That's
but
fair.
He did get the pin.
Yeah, George Steele is such an interesting topic. Like I don't know if we would do an episode on George Steele because it's not like watching a bunch of his matches. He was a major monster heel in the 70s and so on, and he would only wrestle 3 months a year because he had a regular job as a was he a wrestling coach? He was a sports coach of some kind at a college, and he, during his summers, he would go to a different region of the country and be George the Animal Steele. And he had said and nobody at his regular job knew. The kids didn't know because wrestling wasn't national on television like that. Occasionally, he said very occasionally, he'd get a fan who had moved around or had seen him in the magazines and went up to him and was like, "Are you George the Animal Steele?" To which his stock answer would be like, "You think I'm as ugly as George the Animal Steele?" Which shut down all the conversations at that point because he was like a professor, you know, and George Steele was monster animal guy.
A couple other things about George Steele. Number one, did you ever see Tim Burton's film about Ed Wood?
Oh, of course, yeah.
I
would say that is Tim Burton's best movie.
He stars in that. He's Tor Johnson.
He plays Tor Johnson.
Yeah. Oh shit! Okay, yeah.
The other thing is when he transitioned from heel to face, they gave him all of these psychological treatments, like shock therapy and all this. Those vignettes are fucking crazy.
They're funny from the mid '80s.
Yeah.
Very mid '80s.
Alrighty. All right, so we're trying to keep these minis mini because they were getting kind of long for a while there.
Yeah, we can all rant about a variety of topics forever. If you'd like to hear us talk for more, subscribe to our feed, leave us a review, give us a like, give us a subscribe, tell your friends. If you really like us, subscribe to our Patreon. For $5 a month, you get a whole extra full episode to complement all the episodes that we do, plus the entirety of our archives of premium episodes, which we have done one a week for the entire time we've been doing this podcast. Please check that out at patreon.com/contestingwrestling.
If you liked our episode with M2J, Matt Josephson, this week we have a new premium episode also with him as our guest talking about Hulk Hogan. So check that out.
And get ready for coming up this Monday is going to be part 2 of our series on Chris Jericho. If you are a premium subscriber, it's actually going to be part 3. Yeah, it's some good stuff. Jericho is, we did a total of 4 episodes about Chris Jericho, and I didn't get tired of him. He's fucking Renaissance man, masterpiece, love it. Can't wait for it. So follow us on Twitter at ContestingW. Let us know if there's anything you'd like us to cover, anything that you think would help me enjoy wrestling more, or anything that you think is further evidence that I should continue to hate wrestling. Either
any and all. We are contesting wrestling. We're not let's get Evan to like wrestling.
Exactly.
Stay out of the ocean.
Stay out of the ocean because we love you and we care about you. Thank you.